My talk is more of a brainstorm. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. So this is more of a brainstorm on a very large and general issue, which came to my notice because of problems I had during the writing of my thesis with theories on the origin of the Runic script, namely the presuppositions about how we imagine script to be transferred to a new writing community. Specifically, I want to talk about whether new scripts come about through gradual diffusion or whether they are purposefully created. This may seem a bit naive, but I could not quite find out what the general stance is on this. I have to say comparative grammatology is not my area, and I wanted to talk about this topic here mainly in the hope that I can get some input from you. So just to give you an impression of what the problem is with the runes. Here's the older Futhark, the original rune row, which was used between the 2nd and the 8th century AD. As you can see, it is clearly an alphabetic script, and similarities to the Mediterranean alphabets are immediately evident. However, many of the actual letter shapes are quite unusual. There are quite a few surprising grapheme phoneme correspondences. As seen in the drawing, which is the runic equivalent of an alphabetarium, the order of the row is entirely different, and there are lexically meaningful Germanic letter names. The runes pop up somewhat suddenly on portable items in the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD in southern Scandinavia. The earliest inscriptions are very short. Where they are understandable, they encode names, owners, writers, etc. There is no public literacy in the earliest phase. There is some debate on which exact Germanic language stage is encoded in the earliest inscriptions. It is accordingly hard to argue how well the Futhark represents the phonemic systems of the languages it writes. Graphically, the older Futhark is very uniform. There are minor graphic letter variants very early on, but no actual regional or chronological variants. But the writing direction is not fixed, word separation is optional, and retrograde runes and ligatures are common. So this is a script that is baffling in many respects, and the contributions to the question of how it came to be are legion. They are usually collected in 3 camps, which derive the runes from the Latin, the Greek, or a North Italic alphabet, respectively. There is no single Mediterranean alphabet which does everything a model ought to do, namely, provide models for all runes, writing conventions, and text types, explanations for the deviant order of the letter names, as well as a plausible historical context for the borrowing. So you can either bring in multiple source alphabets or try to come up with reasons for why the runes look and behave different. Usually we start out from a few seemingly obvious correspondences. Then we work our way through the runic inventory by adducing increasingly problematic motivations for discrepancies. And usually we are left with a number of letters which can only be explained under a certain suspension of disbelief or are left unaccounted for. It is often attempted to support individual derivations by citing parallels from other alphabets, by positing principles of rune formation, which are then circularly used to motivate the forms they were inferred from, and or by making assumptions about the circumstances of the derivations. But ad hoc explanations are equally numerous: how sound values were switched, or adapted or misinterpreted, and letters were inverted and mirrored and doubled and confused with each other, and so on. Richard Morris called this the mental gymnastics of runic derivation. So maybe it is not surprising that there is a school of thought in runology which licenses sidestepping the problem of letter correspondence entirely, on the basis of the claim that the Futhark is not the result of an adoption, whose deviating features must be reasonably accounted for, but an adaptation undertaken by a purposeful creator, the rune master. The rune master made arbitrary decisions about the treatment of letter shapes and values, superfluous letters and the introduction of new ones, the level of orderliness, the overall style, about every aspect of the new script he created. As a consequence, the modern scholars attempt to derive each rune from a letter in a Mediterranean alphabet must be a fruitless endeavor. That's again Morris. Fritz Askeberg said that the Futhark was not a slavish copy, but a rather free reworking of the model. Suggested reasons for such an extensive reworking often involve ethno-nationalistic motives in group writing. I learned yesterday that this is called. Most runologists appear to think of an individual creator, usually some variety of upper-class Germanus, with competence in writing the source language, often even with some level of classical education. But sometimes this view is rejected with some emphasis. Isaac Taylor thought that the developments undergone by scripts are subject to laws akin to those governing language, and he criticized one theory which included complicated derivations of each rune from a Latin letter, saying, several of the runes, instead of having been evolved, like the letters of all other alphabets, by the action of slow and natural processes, must have been invented offhand by some alphabetic lawgiver whose arbitrary behests were promptly obeyed over a vast region. Similarly, and also quite sassily, Otto Schrader wrote that the notion of an ingenious preceptor Germaniae, as that man has in all seriousness been called, who assembled an alphabet for his Germans, lacks any analogy in cultural history. Both these examples are 19th century, but there are also current scholars like Bengt Odenstedt and Tom Markey, who expressly reject the creative rune master. Now, the idea that someone must have tinkered with the model for the runes is not just an excuse to save oneself the task of explaining the script's weirdness. The deviating order of the row is best explained through the invention of a creator, even if his motives remain unclear. And the uniformity of the earliest runic documents is frequently taken to speak for a one-off creation. But all features which have been claimed in favor of a rune master have also been explained away or explained differently, and it is far from clear whether a sophisticated creator of the runes ever existed. It is admissible to argue that certain differences between the runic script and the Mediterranean alphabets point to his existence, but this assessment is tentative and must not in turn be used to explain those very same characteristics. So to avoid the circularity of the argument, it has been claimed, for example, by Elmer Antonsen, that writing is never borrowed via diffusion, but always systematically adapted by an individual. And now my question is this true? What do we think about that? I did not find many explicit statements on the matter, but one probably very influential one can be found in the study of writing, of course. Gelb observes that we must always reckon, in the case of all great cultural achievements, with the decisive intervention of men of genius. However, he also admits that, unfortunately, we do not know any of the geniuses who were responsible for the most important reforms in the history of writing. Their names are lost to us forever in the dimness of antiquity. Alex de Vogt states that the emergence of borrowed script happens relatively suddenly, and that they need to be largely completed before the script can be put to use. And Michael O'Connor observes that there is a long-standing and plausible tradition of regarding writing as an invention, i.e., as something that reflects the work of one person at one time. These views are on first glance supported by the data. Well-documented cases of the emergence of new scripts are almost exclusively cases of a purposeful creation. Sophisticated ones, like James Fraser's script for the Lisu language, and unsophisticated ones, like Sequoia's Cherokee syllabary. The question is, to what extent these apparently clear-cut statistics reflect reality? Is Gelb right in saying that the creator always exists and we just don't know his name if he existed too far back? Or are we wrong to judge the situation in antiquity and earlier on the basis of modern conditions? Because the abundance of historically documented creations of scripts is in large part due to colonialism and the activity of Christian missionaries. It might be asked whether scripts have even had much of a chance to diffuse anywhere since the onset of the Age of Discovery. Also, it might be argued that cases of creation are the ones which will be documented, usually by the creator, while examples for the gradual, decentralized and unsupervised diffusion of a script into a previously illiterate society may go under the radar. Of course, this issue is the question of when we call a script a new script rather than the same script for a new language. But this is a very complex topic on its own, and I'm going to skirt it. That decentralized diffusion does exist also in modern times is shown by de Vogt and Döhler, speakers of Nubian in Sudan have recently taken to using the Arabic script to write their vernacular in public graffiti. There are only few changes from Arabic orthography and sound values, but those appear to have been agreed upon by convention in the small writing community. Quote, in this case, there is no clear inventor or teacher of the writing system whom we can immediately identify. So, what about cases other than modern ones, in which the process of development can be retraced with some certainty? Well, as you all know, they are few and far between. There are a handful of good examples for script creation which are mentioned with great frequency, prominently, and also from a missionary context. Bishop Wulfila's Gothic alphabet. Wulfila is credited with the invention of the Grammata Gothica on the basis of the Greek alphabet by various ecclesiastical historians already in the 5th century, and I am informed that their testimony is not usually called into question. Then, of course, there is the most sophisticated of all the grammatogenies, Hangul, whose creation and promulgation in the 1440s was obligingly accompanied by a proclamation and a handbook. But things are rarely this unambiguous. For example, another famous document which has long been considered to refer explicitly to the creation of a new script is the Behistun inscription of the Persian king Darius I in the 6th century BC. The inscription includes a section which has been interpreted as announcing that Darius commissioned the invention of the old Persian cuneiform, which was then used for the first time in the Behistun inscription. However, this interpretation of the text is by no means evident and has been repeatedly contested. Also, a one-off script invention under Darius has been questioned because of the lopsided character inventory, which has been explained as the relics of an older version of the script, a possibly defective pseudo-cuneiform writing tradition which predates Darius's reign. Also a bit dubious are the claims to fame of a couple of ecclesiastical alphabet creators who are often mentioned beside Wulfila. Saint Cyril is credited with the invention of the glagolitsa, but it has been suggested by Paul Kabale that the glagolitsa originally arose through an ad hoc use of Greek cursive letters to write Macedonian Slavic for trade and military purposes, and was then only expanded by Cyril, who added letters for the Slavic sounds which are not present in Greek. Similarly, the creation of the Armenian alphabet by the cleric Mashtots is well established, but there was an earlier script which is referred to as a random collection of foreign letters little suited to represent the sounds of Armenian, which may indicate an older tradition of writing Armenian with Semitic scripts. Mashtots actually spent 2 years teaching this before he got tired of dealing with its shortcomings and proceeded to create a better system, which was mainly based on Greek, but for which he appears to have recycled elements of the older existing scripts. And the man's association with the Georgian alphabet, which he is also supposed to have invented, is even more dubious, as it appears that he did not, in fact, speak Georgian. We get here into the difficult area of culture heroes, self-proclaimed but more often established through history. The men who are credited with the creation of Old Persian cuneiform and the above-mentioned alphabets may be argued to have reworked pre-existing traditions of writing in the languages for which they are supposed to have first created their new script. So unless we choose to think that all the respective proto-versions were in turn invented by unknown individuals, this contradicts Defogt's claim that new scripts must be created and completed before they can be used, and only undergo any gradual development after they have been put in place. Rather the other way around, the nomination of culture heroes may obscure the previous existence of literacy, which did not depend on outright adaptations. And indeed, in cases where either no secondary intervention happened, or such an intervention happened late enough that we have a lot of older material, we observe script diffusion and gradual development, as for example in the transfer of the alphabet to Italy. If we look at one of the oldest preserved Greek language inscriptions from Italy and the oldest document of written Etruscan, there are hardly any formal differences between the two inscriptions. And the older Etruscan alphabetaria show that the Etruscans adopted the alphabet, whomever they got it from exactly, without any changes with regard to their different phonemic system. Only by and by do the Etruscan alphabetaria reflect a process of adaptation to writing practice. And even these came in such a piecemeal manner that it is hard to argue for comprehensive orthographic reforms. And if there were such reforms, they only officially implemented previous developments which had gradually established themselves in use. There are also orthographic features of archaic Etruscan and of archaic Latin writing, which indicate that nobody thought too hard about this. And the question of how hard did someone actually think about this is also pertinent to my last example, the ever-intriguing Greek alphabet, maybe the most famously ingenious script invention. Only a brilliant mind could have appreciated the difference between the Phoenician and Greek language structures and the significance of vowels and come up with such a clever way of using superfluous Phoenician letters to denote them. Now, Soeva has talked yesterday about how this is not how things work out. And even if we would want to just replace the Greek genius with some other Indo-European speaking genius, the fact remains that the association of Phoenician and Indo-European sound values is to a certain extent obvious in terms of the reinterpretation of letter names whose consonantal anlouds were non-phonemic in Indo-European languages. According to the naturalness approach, which is, I believe, supported by Briggs, the consonantal anlouds were simply lost to speakers of Indo-European languages, so that the resulting vowel initial names determined new vocalic sound values. We don't need a genius for that. We actually know this phenomenon from the later development of Runic. Lillian Jeffrey, who was skeptical of the existence of a script inventor, devoted some space in the local scripts of archaic Greece to the discussion of diffusion and invention, in which contexts they arise, and how to tell them apart. So either the knowledge of writing diffuses inevitably into a previously illiterate community, the system is adopted and then gradually adapted to circumstances in use. It is subjected to a mainly phonetically conditioned process of gradual change, which eventually results in a more or less different system, which may be considered new. Or the source system is purposefully changed and strategically adapted before being put to use. According to Jeffrey, diffusion implies the involvement of a larger number of people, a longer time needed before changes are established, and a less uniform result, either only in the early phases if secondary regulation happens, or leading to local variance. The eventual result of a new script is not intentional. The users would conceivably consider themselves to be using the model script, even at a time when new conventions had created a script which differs notably and systematically from the model. Invention, on the other hand, is the act of one person or a group, a small group of coordinated persons who devise in relatively short time a new system, more or less closely modeled on an existing one on the drawing board. This new script is immediately uniform, the formalisms and rules are binding, and any variation is the consequence of secondary developments. Jeffrey further associates diffusion with a lack of sophistication. Practical users do not demand a great deal from the system in terms of phonological consistency and precision. They initially adopt graphemes and their values without reflection. Changes and adaptations, such as the loss of superfluous characters or the substitution of foreign sound values with similar ones in the new language, happen automatically. Jeffrey names the creation and distinction of duplicates and the borrowing of individual characters from other sources as innovations which are typical of scenarios of this type. On the other hand, the recycling of unnecessary letters for phonetically dissimilar sounds, the creation of individual characters without a graphic model, as well as changes in script type, she assumes to be particular to sophisticated creations. Now, the reason why some runologists prefer the Rune Master is that it is the slow, unstrategic diffusion borne by many, which is generally considered to lead to results that can be registered statistically, compared, and used to determine what is called principles of alphabet history. A single creator, on the other hand, while he may be equally inclined to make natural, that is, phonologically and graphically obvious and comprehensible choices, must be expected to sometimes solve a problem in a completely arbitrary manner, or even introduce purposefully unnecessary changes, because a new script may be created to emulate all aspects of the model if the latter is not only considered prestigious, but is also positively connotated if an ethno-nationalistic motive is involved, and the creator makes an effort to set his creation apart from the model. Extensive redesigning may take place. And strategic diffusion does not provide a context for abrupt changes by which a system loses its tradition of transmission. Even small-scale creative innovations would have a hard time getting established, and the reasons for why things developed as they did should be reconstructible. However, the differences between the two types of script transfer, as posited by Jeffrey, are not quite as clear-cut and need some refinement. Firstly, the kinds of changes that are supposed to be typical for the different scenarios are not quite clear. For example, we have good evidence for sophisticated script inventors drawing inspiration from more than one script. Secondly, the distinction between unsophisticated diffusion and sophisticated creation, as implied by Jeffrey, is not correct. We know that script invention can be unsophisticated to a point where the inventor was not literate before coming up with his new script, whereas for diffusion, people who use the model script for their own language must have some idea of how to write the source language, or must have had at least the most basic instructions. The problem here is the definition of what one considers sophisticated. Thirdly, there is a considerable number of scenarios which are hard to assign to either of the two options, like when writing is adopted within a small but uncoordinated group of people, like scribes of a group of monasteries. The main problem, however, is a methodological one, namely that it is more often than not impossible to be sure what we are faced with, because the impression we get depends on the transmission situation. Jeffrey herself notes that uniform invented scripts are not stable and variation will develop. And on the other hand, as we have seen, gradual diffusion can be cut short by the intervention of a culture hero or any regulating body at any point. And depending on where our attestation sets in, we may misinterpret the state of the script and the reasons behind its characteristics. We may overlook a systematic creation if the inventor's name is lost and the oldest documents already show some variation. And we may take for an original one-off creation a script that is really just a secondary regulation of a gradually evolved tradition, especially if there is a prominent name associated with it. And then we try to explain the script's characteristics, receive mixed signals, and end up mystified by why certain features do not agree with how we imagine this script came to be and cannot be explained that way. So, my surprising conclusion, it is probably best for now not to make sweeping statements about how script transfer works. Also, there is a final thing I'd like to say. It may be observed that scholars who are concerned with scripts which are known to have been created by highly competent persons with a free hand, such as the Gothic alphabet, still occupy themselves with the search for the models of individual letters. The assumption that the creator invented letters and rules and introduced changes off the top of his head is considered, I believe, a last resort. And this also applies in practice to runologists, which accounts for the fact that despite the popularity of the rune master, so many scholars still publish theories on why the Futag is the way it is. And this approach is methodologically sound, as pointed out by Wolfgang Krause, who called the assumption of a creative rune master to account for the rune's peculiarities a non-explanation. Similarly, Paul Kaberle writes on the Glagolitsa, that theories which explain the Glagolitsa as a completely original creation are, quote, quite unchallengeable in any formal sense. If we assume that any irregularity or unexpected element in a derived script is due to the arbitrary decisions of an unknown figure lost to history, we move on methodologically dangerous grounds. Of course, this does not mean that theories which include formal letter derivations according to the naturalness approach could not do with a higher level of methodical rigor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinna, for this very inspiring talk. And I can assure you that the visual syntax of your slides has been very much appreciated. As an illiterate inventor of script, I think you are referring to the Cherokee syllabary.
I'm sorry, I missed the last sentence.
As an inventor, illiterate inventor of script, you are referring to the Cherokee syllabary?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I thought so. I have a question by Natalia Elvira.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your talk. It was really nice, and I do agree with most of what you have said. I just wanted to point out an interesting parallel that they already know. Sveva talked to us about Carrion the other day, and about this chaos theory of just mixing graphemes with the different phonemes from the, let's say, like model alphabet, which for Carrion is supposed to be Greek and so on. And Diego recently tried to explain this kind of, well, this is from cursive to, so from lapidary Greek to cursive and then to lapidary Carrion. And I thought that you might find his work interesting, an interesting parallel for Runic. I cannot assess the validity of what he says because I don't know much about Carrion or Runic, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that parallel.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The similarity between what is weird about Runic and what is weird about Carrion are actually quite amazing. We have exactly that same situation of some letters being obviously the same and random value, and other letters which can be made to work by turning them and switching them around a bit, and other letters which just make no sense at all with a Greek or Latin model respectively. I know Diego's 2007 book, is there anything that sort of updates that? Anything newer?
I think he made a chapter for a book in, I don't know, but it was like 2017 or 2016. Okay. Oh, Sveva just wrote it down. Diego 2019.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And a question by James Byers.
Yeah, another contrast between invented and naturally evolved systems, I don't know, sort of conflicts with some of your values. It seems like the invented systems actually are less practical. They may be more logical, but they just don't really work. So even Korean Hangul, very logical, brilliant system was very quickly adjusted by actual scribes within, I think, a decade or two. The same thing happens with sign languages. When people try to invent a beautiful sign language system or base it on a spoken language, it always gets nativized very quickly. So is there any evidence for that in the historical record for runes?
No, not really. Like I said, it starts out uniform and it remains uniform. What happens then, like round about the 7th, 8th century, is that the older Futhark gets discarded or changed. It changes on the one hand into the younger Futhark, which is used in Scandinavia, and on the other hand into the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, which is used on the British Isles. And these two are completely different. The Anglo-Saxon Futhark gets more letters to account for sound change, whereas the sign inventory of the younger Futhark is reduced by 1/3. So we end up with 18 instead of 24 letters. And the younger Futhark voor
voorgebruik is nog bezig, ze lopen uit.
Is often used as an example for an actual defective writing system in practice, because it just had way too few letters. So the Futhark did get changed eventually, but not in a way that you could say improved it.
I see.
So yeah. So there's no evidence for it changing soon after it was maybe created to make it better suited to the language.
Okay, thank you very much, Corinna.
Thank you.